Welcome to this explainer. Back in 1897, an Irish writer named Bram Stoker sat down at his desk and finally put a name to his famous vampire, Dracula. It quickly became the most famous horror novel ever written. But Stoker didn't actually invent that name. 400 years before he ever picked up a pen, that name belonged to a very real guy, a 15th century Prince of Wallachia. And as we're about to see, the true history, it's honestly way more terrifying than the fiction.
Right, so we all know the myth, right? The fangs, the slit capes, the creepy castles totally shrouded in mist. But the reality is completely different. The real Dracula didn't need fangs, he had massive wooden stakes. He wasn't some undead creature of the night. He was a real-world warlord fighting for sheer survival in this incredibly volatile buffer zone, just completely squeezed between the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire and the Christian West.
Section 1. The Real Count Dracula. Behind the myth.
So how exactly does a minor, completely mortal prince become synonymous with the ultimate supernatural evil? Well, it actually starts with the wild irony of his own name. You see, Dracula comes from Dracul. His father was inducted into the secret Christian knightly brotherhood called the Order of the Dragon, basically set up to fight the Ottomans. So Dracula technically just meant son of the dragon. But in the local Romanian language, Dracul carries a second, much darker meaning. It means devil. So to the local peasantry watching this guy ride by, Dracula literally meant son of the devil. Talk about a PR nightmare, right?
Section 2. Forged in Captivity. Okay, to really wrap our heads around his legendary brutality, we've got to look at his childhood. This wasn't just some inherent madness. It was a deeply calculated survival mechanism born out of some intense trauma. Just look at this dizzying timeline of shifting power. Vlad was born in 1431, but by 1442, his father was basically forced to hand over 11-year-old Vlad, along with his younger brother Radu, to the Ottoman Sultan as hostages. It was the only way to secure this really fragile political peace. I mean, just imagine being 11 years old, handed over to a hostile foreign empire by your own dad, knowing that your life hangs entirely on his obedience from hundreds of miles away. So, what actually happens in captivity? Well, while his younger brother Radu kind of adapted, converted, and actually became a court favorite, Vlad totally resisted. He was under constant surveillance, and he was forced to witness these horrific public executions by impalement, which was a standard psychological warfare tactic for the Ottomans. But here's the thing. Instead of learning obedience, Vlad studied his captors. He absorbed the actual logistics of terror, he mastered their language, their military tactics, basically treating his imprisonment as an absolute masterclass in violence.
And then comes the ultimate betrayal. While Vlad is still sitting there as a hostage, his father gets assassinated in a marsh. And even worse, his older brother Mircea was captured by their own supposed Christian allies, these Saxon merchants and local Wallachian nobles known as boyars. They blinded his brother with a hot iron poker and literally buried him alive. When that horrific news finally reached Vlad, it cemented this incredibly dark realization. He couldn't trust anybody, absolutely no one, and if he was going to rule, he could only ever rely on absolute terror. Section 3. The Prince of Terror.
Fast forward to 1456. Vlad has fought his way back to power, and he is fully ready to deploy everything he just learned. So he invites the very boyars who had murdered his family to a massive, lavish Easter Sunday feast. Once they're all inside, eating and drinking, he bars the doors. He drags the older lords out into the courtyard and impales them right then and there. And the survivors, still wearing their fine feast clothes, they were forced on this brutal 50-mile death march up into the mountains to manually build his fortress, Poneri Castle. In literally one single day, he systematically wiped out his domestic enemies.
Now, his absolute consolidation of power relied really heavily on his namesake weapon. To be clear, Vlad didn't invent impalement. The Assyrians, the Romans, they used variations of it for centuries. But Vlad, he deployed it with this horrifying, almost industrial efficiency. The stakes were deliberately blunted, not sharp, so victims wouldn't die immediately. They were positioned specifically to maximize visibility and psychological impact. He used the stake to send these undeniable, completely gruesome messages to rival empires and domestic traitors alike.
Moving on to Section 4. War Against an Empire. Of course, Vlad's relentless statecraft inevitably forces a massive collision with the greatest military machine in the medieval world. Sultan Mehmed II, literally the conqueror of Constantinople, demands his annual tribute of 10,000 gold ducats and 500 Wallachian boys. Vlad just flat out refuses. And when the Sultan's envoys show up at his court and refuse to remove their turbans, citing religious custom, Vlad actually nails the turbans directly into their skulls. Then he crosses the completely frozen Danube River in the dead of winter, launching this devastating surprise campaign deep into Ottoman territory. 23,884. That is the exact, specific number of Turks and Bulgarians Vlad reported killing during that winter campaign. And we know this for a fact because he wrote it down in a letter to his ally, the Hungarian king. He wasn't just estimating here. His soldiers had to bring back physical proof, and he counted them with the chilling, incredibly methodical precision of a tax collector. But now, Vlad is facing a completely terrifying mathematical reality. The Sultan is furious. He's marching on Wallachia with this absolutely massive army of at least 90,000 elite soldiers. Meanwhile, Vlad has, at most, 30,000 men. So you got to ask yourself, how on earth do 30,000 guys fight off an overwhelming force led by the guy who just toppled the Byzantine Empire? Well, the short answer is you don't fight them directly. You destroy your own country first. Vlad enacted this incredibly brutal scorched earth strategy. He burned his own local granaries to ash, slaughtered all the livestock, poisoned the drinking wells with rotting animal carcasses, and forced all his own people to flee deep into the Carpathian Mountains. He essentially traded his own land for survival, making absolutely sure the massive Ottoman army would starve and drink poisoned water every single agonizing step they took into Wallachia. And then comes his absolute masterstroke. In the dead of night, on June 17, 1462, Vlad leads a total suicide mission. Just 7,000 cavalry riding straight into the massive Ottoman camp at midnight. He brilliantly turned their massive size against them. In the pitch dark, the panicked Ottoman soldiers ended up slaughtering each other by the thousands, completely unable to tell friend from foe. Vlad actually fought his way toward what he thought was the Sultan's tent, hoping to assassinate him, and then vanished back into the shadows right before dawn. The Sultan did survive the night, but what he saw just a few days later completely broke his army's spirit. As his starving, exhausted troops crested a hill near the Wallachian capital, they stumbled upon the Forest of the Impaled. It was 7 acres filled with 20,000 rotting corpses, all arranged in these eerie geometric patterns. The sight was so mind-bogglingly horrific that Sultan Mehmed II, again, the greatest conqueror of his age, delivered this totally stunned quote. He basically declared he couldn't conquer a man with such a diabolical understanding of warfare. The mighty Ottoman army just turned around and went home. Section 5. Birth of the Vampire Myth. So, how exactly does a real historical prince morph into a legendary pop culture monster? Well, despite actually driving off the Sultan, Vlad's end was remarkably unglamorous. He was betrayed by shifting politics and had to flee to Hungary in 1462, only to be thrown in prison by his own Christian ally for 12 long years. He was finally released to fight again, briefly reclaimed his throne in 1476, but died shortly after in this really minor, muddy skirmish near Bucharest. It's kind of a quiet, forgotten end for such an incredibly loud life. But you know his enemies were going to make sure his story didn't end there. Those Saxon merchants in Transylvania, the ones who hated Vlad for his heavy trade restrictions and violent raids, well, they had access to a brand new invention, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press. And they used it. They churned out these totally lurid, illustrated pamphlets showing Vlad happily dining among corpses and literally washing his hands in blood. These things took off like wildfire, becoming Europe's very first printed horror bestsellers. That propaganda permanently transformed his ruthless political statecraft into this inhuman, supernatural sadism in the eyes of the Western world. And in a really wild twist of dark irony, after Vlad was killed in that muddy skirmish, his head was cut off, preserved in a jar of honey, and sent straight to Constantinople. His lifelong enemies, the Ottomans, displayed his head on a massive stake, literally using his own favorite method of terror right back against him. Meanwhile, the rest of his headless body was supposedly buried at the super-isolated Snagov Monastery. Now, when we look back at all this history, the true origins of the vampire myth become incredibly clear. 4 centuries before Bram Stoker ever even wrote a single word, Vlad's genuine military tactics had already laid out all the forensic markers of a vampire. Just think about it. His behavior, attacking his enemies at midnight and vanishing right before dawn. The imagery, thousands of pale bodies suspended up in the air on stakes, refusing to lie down in the earth. And the archaeology. When researchers finally opened his supposed tomb at Snagov centuries later, it was completely empty. The legend practically wrote itself. Which really leaves us with this final thought. The voivode, the warlord, died. But the vampire lives forever. Look, Vlad the Impaler was a man completely forged by trauma who used unimaginable industrial-scale terror to protect his tiny realm against an overwhelming global empire. But I gotta ask you, knowing all the facts now, isn't the true history of political survival in the 15th century actually far more terrifying than the fictional monster